I was actually trying to think of a category so we could play the game because I was like, all the categories I can think of, she's gonna do them real quick.
So you admit on camera to making this way too hard for your. I hope future guests are looking at this and they are aware of the setup the trap that you set for them.
Let me share this. I'm still thinking of a category, but I'm gonna share this. Let me see. Okay, I shared it to my profile. All right, you ready, Dr. McCray? We're gonna
I, since you admitted to trying to make it too hard for your guests, then the answer is a resounding no.
Oh, okay. I know. I know. We're gonna go in a different. We're gonna go from a different perspective. So we're gonna play my game. You played it before. Is Black Love. I gotta open up my timer. Okay, I got my timer. I'm gonna give you category. You got to name 5 things within 10 seconds in that category. No ums, uhs, ahs, no filler words. Okay. Your category, since you are from the South, this is easy. 5 things that Alabama is known for. Go.
Beaches.
You just said
Oh gosh, I lost already. Okay.
Okay. I give you a different category.
All
Yeah,
right.
I thought you were just
'Cause
gonna be
I
good.
love no, but I love filler words. Yeah, something they've been living with me since I can remember. So I'm gonna lose every time. Filler words and noises. Yeah.
Okay, again, no ums. I like filler words too, but I'm not playing the game, so I'm just the host. I'm like the LeVar Burton of this live stream. Okay, we're gonna stay with Alabama. We're gonna stay with the South. Okay,
Okay.
I want you to name 5 foods that come from Alabama. Go.
Alaga syrup, corn, okra, of course pork, peach cobbler,
Stop. You did
grits.
it.
Okay.
You did it. Okay, what was the syrup? Say it again.
Oh, Alaga? You never heard of that before? I don't
No.
even know if it's really from Alabama or Georgia or both, but it's Alaga. Syrup. That's what my folks, the elders in my community used to eat. I did not like it. It is I think it's sorghum based, if I'm
Um,
not mistaken. And let me see. I would love to know, is it really from Alabama?
sorghum. Okay. And so, did they put it on biscuits, things like that?
Right, yeah. So it says original cane flavored syrup. And me, this was, I guess, when I became aware of it, the 1980s.
Mhm.
So I was very much influenced by television, the media, and I wanted my Mrs. Butterworths.
On the
I couldn't
bottle.
get with the elders in their Alabama, Georgia syrup.
Got it. Interesting. I've never heard of it. Is it alligator syrup?
ALA,
Mhm.
like Alabama,
Uh-huh.
GA, like Georgia.
Alligator syrup.
Alaga, yes.
There it is. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Ifetayo Ojelade, one of my good long-term friends that has been hanging with me for over 20 years now, is here to have a conversation today. This is Dr. Kenja McCray. She's a history professor. Thank you, Dr. McCray, for coming and hanging out with me.
Oh, you're quite welcome. My pleasure.
So we are going to be talking about Pan-Africanism. And we know that Marcus Garvey's birthday was a couple of days ago on the 17th, I believe. And he's one of the big names that is known in the concept of Pan-Africanism. So I want us to just jump in and really kind of get from a historical perspective, because you always remind us to stay in our lane. Because everybody think they're a historian because they done read a book. And Dr. McCray helps us realize that there's actually a science to being a historian. So, why don't you start out and just give us like a definition of what Pan Africanism is?
Okay, so that's a good question because so many people disagree with that, or so many people have different viewpoints of what that is, what Pan Africanism is. And some people, there's so many definitions floating out there that some people decline to even define it. I felt Pan Africanism, the definition was, I guess, obvious because coming to go to school at Spelman College in the West End, it seems as if Pan Africanism is everywhere, right? Symbols of Pan Africanism are everywhere, from red, black, and green, or red, black, and green, red, black, green, and gold flags hanging on people's porches or in the fronts of their business, their storefronts, right? The Shrine of the Black Madonna. It was in the West End, and they have their bookstore and they have their galleries, and it's very Pan Africanism in feel. So I thought Pan Africanism, oh, look at it. Look at the word, is self explanatory, right? It's all things Africanism. I don't know. Yeah. So, but and I have done my master's thesis had a Pan Africanist perspective. My PhD dissertation dealt with Pan Africanist groups, and I talked to a professor at Spelman who's an Africanist.
Mm-hmm.
She asked me some hard questions about what Pan-Africanism is and what's going on with Pan-Africanism today, and I couldn't answer them. I was like, wait, I don't know anything about Pan-Africanism. So,
Wait, what were the questions that she asked you that made you
mm,
realize that? Do you remember?
yeah, like what happened to Pan-Africanism after like 1990? What's going on with Pan-Africanism today? Is there a real Pan-Africanism movement today?
Mm-hmm.
How would you say these people who I feel you were discussing as sort of symbolically Pan-Africanist, what was the political manifestation of their work? What were some economic manifestations of their work? So those kinds of questions.
Got
And those were harder questions for me to answer. And I don't feel, let me be clear, I did not observe that the people I studied were solely symbolically Pan-Africanist,
it. Mm-hmm.
but they were Pan-African cultural nationalists. So a lot of what they focused on was the way that people of African people and people of African descent have a common history, have a common struggle, and share, if we work together, a common destiny. So that's one definition, the belief that African people and people of African descent share a common heritage, share contemporary common struggles, and have a common destiny. That's one definition. Other definitions that I have seen frame Pan Africanism as both a philosophy and a set of movements, interlocking movements that are aimed toward the liberation, independence, sovereignty, and respect of African people worldwide. So, African people on the continent and African people who are dispersed around the globe.
Got it.
So, those are two definitions that I've come across.
Okay. How did you get into Pan Africanism or like researching it?
That's a good question. It was just something that became extremely interesting to me because I believe in my kindergarten to 12th grade schooling, when we had a lot of Black history, particularly because I went to initially a majority Black school that was in my community, the one that my mother went to when she was small. So we had a lot of Black history, but at some point in high school, I realized a lot of our Black history started with chattel slavery. It started with bondage. And I wondered what went on before that. These people had lives, our ancestors had lives before
Mhm.
chattel bondage. And I just became extremely interested in answering that question. And Pan Africanists tended to deal with that question. So I once I became interested in what Pan Africanists were doing in a contemporary context, I started thinking, well, what's the history of this Pan Africanism thing? And that's how I got interested.
Huh, okay. I don't think I knew that.
Really?
No, no, I don't think we've ever talked about it. I just, when I
Wow.
met you, this is, the work that you did. So
That's
interesting.
true. Yeah, because we met
Mhm.
when I was a master's student,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But coming out of high school, I had a lot of questions and sought those answers in part through my studies.
Mhm. And you said in your master's thesis that you partly focused on that. How did you do that? Like, what were you focused on?
So what I focused on for my master's thesis was Oyatunji Village in South Carolina. I know you are familiar with Oyatunji Village. It was founded in 1970, in particular under the leadership of Adefumi the First, and it's in part an intentional community, it's a religious. It's an expression of religious nationalism, but it also has political and economic components that I was interested in. And I saw it as not just a manifestation of religious ideals, but also of an embodiment of Pan Africanism.
Mm.
So, is what Pan Africanism looked like among these people in action,
Okay. So
right?
was thinking about what you said earlier is that you said you would use the term cultural nationalist. You said Pan Africanist and you used the word cultural nationalism. Like, so if it was my dad, he would just, he would balk at the term cultural nationalism. And so I'm wondering if there's a difference because I know in your dissertation work you looked at folks that were cultural nationalists and looked at the Kawaii movement. Is there a difference between like terms like Black nationalism, cultural nationalism, Pan Africanism? That I don't know. It just came to my head when you said like, are those different?
So, this is, I guess, our human tendency to categorize things and further categorize things and give them a name and describe them and parse through their meaning, right? So, nationalism is the belief that a certain people, for whatever reason, be it language, um, be it religion, form a nation. They constitute a nation.
Mm-hmm.
So that could mean that they see themselves as a similar people, and they want to work toward having a nation, as a nation state, as in a political entity with boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could mean that they feel like a nation, they're similar, and one day they may want a nation, some people, but in the some people may not envision a nation, but they might envision independent, strong institutions that serve this particular group who's distinct in certain ways from other groups. Does that
Got
make sense?
it. It does. It does. Yeah.
So, Black nationalism is based in race, right? So this idea that black people, however one might define blackness, constitute a nation. And according to some definitions, black people in the United States constitute a captive nation within a nation, the
Yeah.
United States. Right. And it's not a religious based nationalism. It's not a language based nationalism. It cuts across religion, it cuts across languages, it cuts across various ethnicities. There's this idea that black people, based on their race, constitute a nation. And so it's not only in terms of Pan-Africanism, it's not just people within the United States who believe that, but Marcus Garvey, who had traveled all over the world, really, and definitely all over the Caribbean, Central and South America, and then into the United States, saw that everywhere he went, Black people faced common struggles,
Mm-hmm.
and he was aware that that our ancestors had common origins, common ancestry, and that if we work together, could achieve a common destiny of independence, and that there could be an independent Black nation in Africa.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because what came to my mind is his moniker of one aim, one God, one destiny.
Right.
Um, and just looking at that kind of from a global movement. If we move forward and kind of think about, like, I want to go to this country and then move around. If we think about some of Garveyites in the South, can you tell me a little bit about the history of some of the people that were specifically part of Garvey's movement in the South?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question because a lot of times, so Garvey co-founded with other people, was the leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. And I
Mm-hmm.
think probably a lot of your viewers and listeners will be familiar with that. And a lot of times we think of the UNIA, maybe we associate it with Jamaica because Garvey was Jamaican,
Mm-hmm.
but its headquarters were in Harlem, New York.
Yep.
So a lot of times we think of, in I guess the most specific sense, as the UNIA as a New York thing, but in a broader sense, the UNIA as a northern urban thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I got my PhD from Georgia State, as you know, like you did, and I was interested in going to Georgia State in in part because they had a professor there who had done a book on Garvey and the Garveyite movement called Grassroots Garveyism. And her claim was that we associate Garveyism with these northern urban settings, but that there were more UNIA chapters in the South. And so it had a vigorous following in Southern states and among Southerners. So, for instance, Arkansas alone had in the 1920s 50 UNIA chapters, just the state of Arkansas.
Is that where Malcolm's people were when his dad died? Where were they? Were they in Arkansas? They were
Weren't they?
in.
Weren't they in Nebraska?
Okay,
Oh
sorry.
yeah.
That's totally me in terms of geography. Okay, don't hold
Okay.
me.
I don't know. Yeah, like I think if I remember
Yeah, I think
correctly,
you're
it's
right. It's
Nebraska. Yeah.
Nebraska. Hmm.
And so say for instance, there was when I was reading about women in the UNIA, there was a lady who became a significant speaker in the UNIA. Her name was Laura Atacore Kofi, and she was actually originally from Ghana,
Hmm.
but she became a UNIA speaker, and she was so electrifying that she would attract many, 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 probably about 1,000 new dues paying members who would come to her speeches. And
What
so I read
time
that
was this?
this was also in the 1920s.
Okay.
And so I read about that and I was like, first of all, initially when I read about it, I stopped at she was from Ghana and she came to the United States in the 1920s.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, very very interesting. Like it's just not a common story that I've
Mhm.
heard. So I put the information down and I went to research something else. And I came back later and I was like, and these speeches she was giving were in the United States and in Central America.
Mhm.
And that the a lot of the people were attracted to her speeches and a lot of the new members were drawn from places like Daphne, Alabama and West Palm Beach, Florida.
Really?
Yes.
Now, I knew
Just
Alabama, but West Palm? Really? Oh
yeah, yeah.
my goodness.
Yeah, West Palm Beach, Florida, Daphne, Alabama, places like that. So,
Mhm.
yeah, the Dr. Rollinson at Georgia State did a lot of work in showing like this was a part of the mass movement that was the
Mhm.
UNIA. And a lot of these people were Southerners. And, when you talk about Florida, eventually Laura Atacore Kofi got so popular that Garvey didn't like that. She was expelled from the UNIA. She went on to found her own church and then she was assassinated she was killed, possibly by a UNIA member, as I understand. Now, I should have given a caveat. I'm not a Garveyite scholar. I'm not a UNIA scholar.
Right, but now you done told
Yes,
us all kinds of stuff. I ain't never heard
the
none of this.
go yes, go look at the work of Keisha Blaine, Natanya Duncan. They really chronicled these women's lives very closely.
Mhm.
We should all, if we're interested in Garvey and Garvey's legacy, be interested in those women's work.
I'm putting them down. I did Dr. Rollinson's
Hmm.
book. I put that in there already.
Okay. Yep. And so Keisha N. Blaine, Blain.
Do you know, did she write a book or is it
Hmm. She
journals?
she wrote a book called "Set the World on Fire,"
Okay.
and Natanya Duncan.
Okay. I'm gonna put them both in there.
And
Oops.
she does mostly journal articles, and she has a dissertation out there. And her Natanya Duncan, and she has a speech. I hope it's going to be available to the public. On Garvey's birthday, she did give a speech at Liberty Hall in Jamaica about Garveyite women and their legacies, and it was really good. So I was watching it on YouTube, and if it comes up that it's available, I will definitely share it.
Okay. Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm putting Keisha Blaine in right now. And tell me the second person again.
Natanya Natanya Duncan.
Okay. And do you know the name of her book?
She has journal articles,
Okay.
and her dissertation is about if she labels Garveyite women efficient women. She said
Okay.
that that's how they might have labeled themselves.
Okay.
Mhm.
Interesting. So what I found was interesting is I went to Panama. The first time I went to Panama, I went to the museum there. So they have a museum. Panama has a very interesting history because they have like people of African descent from the Spanish invasions, but then also as a result of lots of folks from the Caribbean as a result of building the Panama Canal that was built by Halliburton. Most people don't know that. So remember
Right.
Halliburton from
I
Iraq?
remember. Mhm.
And the one of the things that I found was interesting in this little museum that's talking about people of African descent in Panama is that there were so many Garveyites in
Yes.
Panama.
Yes.
I was so impressed by that.
Absolutely. And you sound like me when I took a class. I audited a class at Georgia State that was on the something about Latin America.
Hmm.
And for my final project, I wanted to look at the Garveyite movement in Latin America. And it just blew my mind. One, that there were Spanish pages and French pages in the Negro World newspaper that was produced by the UNIA.
Hmm.
that my Spanish was not nearly strong enough to really understand
Mhm.
the level of sophistication in terms of the conversations they were having in the Negro world in Spanish, and how there were all these UNIA chapters in the Spanish speaking world, and Cuba had one, and
Mhm.
places where they couldn't really talk about, put their race out front and have a kind of race first set of values, they
Mhm.
would do interesting things to morph and say this is, this is also about, this kind of value or that kind of value, not necessarily just about Negro improvement, right? Like the Universal Improvement Association, drop Negro, that kind of thing. Very interesting.
Huh.
And there were chapters. So we're talking about the North, we're talking about the South, we're talking about Central America. There were chapters in South America. There were chapters in the Midwest. So once Garvey was convicted of fraud and spent time here in Atlanta in the penitentiary in the 1920s. And then his sentence was commuted by Calvin Coolidge, President Calvin Coolidge, but he was deported. And
Mhm.
so the UNIA started to fall in disarray. There was some infighting. But at I think around 1940, the headquarters were moved from Harlem to Cleveland. So Keisha Blaine points out in her work, in her speeches a lot, that we think about the North, and I might say we started a conversation about the UNIA in the South, but we don't think about the UNIA in the Midwest.
Mm-mm.
But maybe if you go back and read Malcolm X's influences through his mom, Louise Little, you'll see, wait, there's a Garveyite thing going on in the Midwest too, right?
Mhm.
So it was all over. And we talked about Ghana, Atacore Kofi, but there were actual UNIA um, 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 chapters in Ghana, in South Africa. Yeah, all over.
In Ghana too?
Hmm. Yep. So
Wow.
that's That's also Pan Africanism in action.
So how does I think when at least when I think about it, because again, I'm not a historian, I think of Garvey as the kind of the initiator of Pan-Africanism. Is that correct? Or how is he associated with the concept of Pan-Africanism? Because I see those two things as linked.
Oh wow, yeah. So they are linked, but he's not definitely not the initiator of Pan Africanism.
Okay.
So depending on whose work you read, Pan Africanism, the roots of Pan Africanism, let's just say the antecedents of Pan Africanism can be placed in uh something like some people would say in the hold of the slave ships. In the
Mm.
hold of the ships that our enslaved ancestors were packed in as cargo. So people might cite a Michael Gomez's book and saying once those our ancestors exchanged their country marks, the ones that would have identified the people they came from in West and Central Africa, for a different identity once they saw that everybody in the hold of the ship looked like them, no matter whether if they were Ibibio or Igbo or Yoruba or Hausa or what have you, that they were in a similar situation, right?
Mhm.
And so they were different people at that point. People say the roots of the ideology of Pan Africanism were forming there.
Mhm.
So it wasn't a coherent movement at that time, but the
Mhm.
roots were there. And some authors, some experts will place the roots of the movement in the abolitionist movement. So there are a couple of newer books out on Pan Africanism that I think are really interesting.
Mhm.
Um, one is Pan Africanism: A History, and it's by Hakeem Adi. So Hakeem Adi.
Mhm.
That one is a I find it to be very accessible in terms of the reading and the way it flows. But D outlines how Pan-Africanism was really taking coherence, really took coherence, developed coherence as a movement with abolitionism. So people in both on the continent, in Europe, and in the United States, and in the British North American colonies, talking about um, and getting together, banding together to 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 work toward African people's freedom, their liberation, and then um, to eliminate racism,
Mhm.
working to ameliorate the conditions that African people were finding themselves in. But in terms of Pan Africanism, as a very, very coherent set of ideas and an ideology that people start to organize around very consciously. A lot of people put that in the or track that back to trace it back to 1900, when the first Pan African Conference was started by Henry Sylvester Williams. So uh, depending on where you look, you're going to get some different answers as to the origins. But I hope that wasn't confusing. I was just giving
No, no, no. It
some
makes sense because
perspective.
in my head, I always link those two. But then I'm actually slowly working myself through Ida B. Wells, A Sword Among Lions,
Hmm.
and that's Paula Gittins' work about Ida B. Wells,
Hmm.
and which I wish was on an audio book, but that's a whole other thing that
Right.
I don't understand why this amazing work is not an audio book. So as she's talking and going through that history, then I'm seeing like, okay, there's these roots of Pan-Africanism that are there too, and some of the journalists talking about it. So I know it started before Garvey, but I think it's interesting because in my mind I'm connecting it with that. And I see Chinzira made a comment. She was like, she loves your comment of Pan-Africanism was born in the hull of the slave ship. I think that that's important because one of the comments I hear people make all the time is, and you and I have talked about this, is so there's this idea that like African people were selling each other. And I'm like, no, they weren't selling each other. They were selling their enemies. They didn't have a sense of Pan Africanism. They didn't have a collective identity. These were different ethnic groups. And that's kind of the interesting thing is you got all these different ethnic groups, and enslavers understood that. That's why they would have people in different ethnic groups on the ships so they couldn't communicate with each other. But then, like you said, Michael Gomez talks about that transformation of like in the hull of slave ship, you looking around and everybody, at least phenotypically in some way looks like you, and you recognize we're all in the same situation. So we've got to be able to do something. So that there's this transformation that's taking place from different ethnic groups to we need to be this collective to work together.
Right. Yes. And I like to talk to students about that concept too. So some students will, of course, with teaching, sometimes people think, oh, it's teaching history and you just teach the history and that's it. And of course, I think now with the whole mess that's coming up about and around critical race theory, or what people are labeling critical race theory, and a lot of it
Are
is
you
just
teaching
doesn't.
critical race theory in your classes?
No, not at all. I do not teach critical race theory. I don't use that methodology. And it's not that it's not a good methodology, an important methodology. It's just it's really specific. And that's not, I didn't have
Law
training in
school.
critical. Thank you. Okay. So but they're aiming the ire, the anger at his history, right? And some
Mm.
of the really what I think are important perspectives that uh, African um people are bringing to the study of US history. So I said all that to say, obviously, there's a lot of emotion around history,
Mhm.
even though it's been treated like just the facts, and only the facts in the past. So, a good, um, instructors, good teachers who know their craft know that they have to deal with emotions in the classroom. So when, of course, we talk about West Africa and Central Africa before for the 1400s, and then
Mhm.
after, during and after, I let students express their emotions, and inevitably somebody said, I'm frustrated because we sold each other. I'm frustrated because Africans sold us. And we have to break that conversation down. And that is a good point to talk about how this idea of uh, we are one people, right? We have a common ancestry, a common history, and a common struggles develops over time.
It
And
develops in the diaspora. It's not it's not there on the continent. That is like
mm,
a kind of
I think the making of the diaspora develops this making, this that develops Pan Africanism. But
hmm,
there is it's so the other book that I uh suggest is a handbook of Pan Africanism by
mhm,
Rayland. It's edited by Rayland Rabaka. So it's RelandRabak.
okay.
A handbook of Pan Africanism.
Okay. Got it.
It's it's not Pan Africanism 101. Uh, uh, Hakeem Adi developed Pan Africanism a history for teaching survey courses, general survey courses. So the book is very accessible to beginners who
Mhm,
want to know more about Pan Africanism. Rabaka's edited volume is more for advanced conversations about Pan Africanism. And I brought that up to say one particular chapter in Rabaka's work claims that Pan-Africanism don't be too quick to say Pan-Africanism didn't develop in West Africa, because some of the first abolitionists were actually West Africans, and then goes into the that particular to defend his point. So this is very interesting. Um, there's so much more to know about Pan Africanism, and initially I felt bad, like, okay, I've done this whole dissertation on Pan African cultural nationalism, and there's so many questions I cannot answer about Pan Africanism. But after reading the handbook of Pan Africanism, I and Pan Africanism, a history, I developed a really, really understanding of how vast Pan Africanism is and how much there still is to know about it.
interesting.
Yeah, because even when we're talking about the development of a West African identity,
Mhm,
um, uh, that happens among people on the continent, from the continent. And it didn't even cross my mind that this actually takes people developing, saying, "Hey, wait, we're kind of we cohere in these ways. We're similar in these ways, and let's meet and caucus and talk about it and think about what we're going to do in terms
mhm,
of working together for our sovereignty, right? That kind of thing." And it's, a lot of it is around anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, a lot
mhm,
of the work that they do, but the issues of identity and who's a part of Pan Africa, right? Who's a part of a unified Africa and who's not, really comes up over and over and over again. And in
mhm,
particular, this concept of Pan Africanism is in terms of the congresses and the conferences, it is really, really centered in the diaspora initially. But in terms of when you set the definition for Pan-Africanism and you look and say, okay, well, abolitionism, there's a strain of Pan-Africanism that's expressed as abolitionism. And so prior to 1900, there are many, many people in West Africa who are doing the work of saying, hey, we need to work together for the freedom of all our people, and who go back and forth. They are born in Sierra Leone, and then they travel to the United States, where they get education and they work with African Americans, and they go back and forth. There's that. but yes, I don't want to blow off the fact that when you talk about the conferences, when you're talking about the congresses, initially there's a whole phase from 1900 to 1945 where they're all centered in the diaspora and really centered diasporic thinkers and diasporic activists, whether the person is from Trinidad or whether the person is W.E.B. Du Bois from Massachusetts or whether it's Garvey from Jamaica, um,
George Padmore.
Patmore, like I said before,
Mhm.
Williams, the
Mhm.
Amy Ashwood Garvey, who's very supportive of the development of the fifth Pan African Congress, and she's Jamaican. So
Mhm.
many people. There's a host of activists that both Adi and the authors in Rebecca's book introduce us to.
You just actually made me think, and this might be a stretch. Nzinga, Queen Nzinga,
Hmm.
um, could she be considered a Pan Africanist? An early thinker in Pan Africanism, just in terms of her being against enslavement and fighting the Portuguese.
Yeah, yes.
Sorry, I'm stretching it too
That's
much.
kind of complex, but
I mean, I know, I
first of
know
all,
that's
huh,
you
go
know,
ahead.
no, I'm just saying that I know like Angolan history is not your thing, but when you said that, I was just thinking. I mean, because she was pretty darn adamant about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there needs to be more work on, or I need to read more work, I might be ignorant to what's out there, but in terms of what's already been written, but I really think there's more work that I need to discover or that needs to be done on abolitionism as an expression of Pan Africanism. Because what I've been reading about Pan Africanism, honestly, prior to these two books, really does start in 1900.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, it really does with the first Pan African conference.
Got it. I mean,
Yeah.
I was just thinking about Nzinga. I don't remember if it's Michael Gomez's book or it might be Jason Young's book. He might be somebody's talking about it. Don't give me the lying. They're talking about Nzinga and her being very much with the kind of the Catholic identity and the Portuguese identity, and then her making this dramatic shift. And she's like, period, point blank, you're not taking anybody, you're not taking my people, nobody else up out of here and enslaving nobody. And so I'm like, okay, so this is early on, and she's got these ideas about abolitionism.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
and
and let's say proto Pan Africanist. Maybe she's a proto Pan Africanist. It's not being called Pan Africanism at the time, and there's no conference or congress or caucus or whatever. But her the thinking, her transformation is certainly a part of the early formation of this idea that we cannot operate and live in these silos.
mm-hmm,
I'm this ethnicity, or the queen of this nation, and I look out for only the upper and middle class of this nation, or
mm-hmm,
if you could say that,
mm-hmm,
the privileged classes, the royalty, whatever, but that we have to think beyond that. And that's definitely wherever people are thinking beyond the the kind of ethnicities and religious enclaves. And I hope that's not too negative of a word. I want to be more neutral, but those categories, and saying we have a common struggle,
mm-hmm.
then that's at least proto Pan Africanism. Yeah.
I like that proto Pan Africanism. So maybe we
Mhm.
can come up with a list of people that are proto Pan African.
Right.
Perhaps Queen Nzinga is in that list. Um,
Yeah, but you threw me for a loop because I thought you were talking about Queen Nzinga, Ratabisha
Heru. Oh
Haru,
no, I'm
right? And I was like,
sorry.
yes, yes, of course.
No, it's just when you said that, I hadn't thought about that, and as I was listening to you, and I was like, "Huh," because she fit in this category. So, my bad with that. But that actually made me think of another thing in terms of what would you say, and we've got like maybe 15 more minutes, what are the pitfalls when you think about the history? And I heard an early thing of Garvey kicking folk out because he didn't like their popularity. But what would you say, like, as you just look back, like, some of the lessons learned?
Yeah, well, so I mean, we know when we talk about Marcus Garvey, we lot of us love and respect Garvey and what he did. Nobody, I cannot imagine. Like he was 28 when he got started with the UNIA, I think. And like I can't imagine being that together at 28, right? And
Mm,
then having this global movement, sparking this global movement that attracts millions of people to do the work of Pan Africanism. I just can't imagine. So, but when we talk about pitfalls, then, we know one of the recurring criticisms of Garvey is that he tried to do it all and position himself to be the king of everything. And we know that we don't all have all the knowledge and all the expertise, I guess, which links back to you talking about my common criticism of people who are not historians who are like, I'm a historian because, this, that, or the third thing. We all have our expertise. And and then I'm not saying that you have to be formally educated to have expertise. I'm
right,
just saying that not one person knows everything, not one
right,
person can do everything. And so we need to remember that everybody has value, everybody's knowledge. Um, uh, everybody can bring knowledge and experience to the table, and we have to respect that, whether it's men, women, members of the LGBTQ community, whether they're intellectuals, whether they're working class or poor people,
mm,
that everybody has something to bring to the table.
right,
And it wasn't just Garvey, right? It was Garvey and Du Bois, we know that rivalry, right, wasn't in the UNIA and the NAACP. It was elites and the intelligentsia, right, leading the aspects of the movement, and not not incorporating working class people's needs and visions and values and leadership, drawing on their
mm,
leadership, and
mm,
so that's important, right? Be inclusive, um uh develop everybody's leadership potential, develop everybody's potential to become their best person,
mm,
in their making their contributions. So those are some of the pitfalls. There's some larger ones. I think I touched on it, which is, and you did too, which is a lot of the early work of Pan-Africanism as a movement, if we're talking about from 1900 to 1945, was very centered in the diaspora.
mm,
And it took um the I think the Manchester Congress in 1945, Manchester, England conference, was the turning point. And people who participated and who planned it had a vision to take Pan-Africanism home, as they called it. And so that was the fifth Pan-African Congress, if I didn't say that already. So the sixth, what they call the six pack, the sixth PAC, was in Tanzania. And that 1945 represents um, a time when Pan Africanism became centered and rooted on the African continent, and a time when it was able to focus on African issues, continental African issues, not
mm,
diasporic as much, totally center on diasporic African issues. But even once that happened, I think we have to understand that there still has to be a balance. So it can't be overly focused on the continent. It can't be overly focused on the diaspora. It can't be overly focused on intellectuals over workers. It can't be overly focused on workers over intellectuals. You can't just kick all the intellectuals out. And then there's the way it consolidated itself, say for instance, through the formation of the African Union, right? The Organization of African Unity, and then the
Mhm.
formation of the African Unity. How then does Pan-Africanism exist on an institutional level, in particular on an international level,
Mhm.
and still include the grassroots? I
Mm.
think there's still issues that need to be worked out in those ways.
Some of the things that I was thinking of, because as a psychologist, I'm gonna think about it from a particular perspective, and I see Shanzira is kind of making a she made a comment as it's a shame that the brothers was moving on on the sisters in leadership. I mean, I think kind of following that code of personality, because that you can have those leaders that have the charismatic leader that is problematic, and we've seen that over time in history, and just kind of following a person and a personality as opposed to being clear about the ideas, the conflicts that have happened. Particularly during that time, I think that there were women in leadership, but then at the same time, there were women that pushed out of leadership positions. So I think we can't discount the sexism. Um, that has historically been in those situations. And then and again, I've been reading so many books that I don't remember what this one came from, because I'm not a historian, so I don't try to keep this stuff in my head like that. And one of the things that I was reading about the there being a controversy with Marcus Garvey and his first and the second wife, like there being some kind of overlap. Have you read anything about that?
I'd say definitely again check out Keisha Blaine and Natanya Duncan's work.
Mhm.
They both deal with both Amy Ashwood Garvey, the
Mhm.
first, Garvey's first wife, and that short-lived marriage, and then Amy Jakes Garvey, Garvey's second wife, the mother of his two sons, the woman who carried on his legacy and published like philosophy and opinions and Garvey and Garveyism. And their relationship, it's sometimes foggy
Mhm.
because my understanding is they were compatriots within the UNIA.
Mhm.
But then there were some issues that I remember reading about in Blaine's book between Amy Ashwood and Marcus Garvey,
Mhm.
that made it sort of obvious why the relationship didn't last long.
Mhm.
And she, I think, describes the two women as really different in certain ways.
Mhm.
Amy Ashwood Garvey being very public, a very, very public mover and shaker, very talented, and connected woman. And Amy Jakes Garvey also being talented and connected, but being more of a
Behind the
behind the
scenes.
scenes worker.
Mhm.
And if you're looking at, what people are writing about Garvey's personality, you can see how the second Amy would mesh more with Marcus Garvey than the first. And in terms of their relationship, the two women,
Mhm.
sometimes one says something about their relationship that doesn't seem to comport with other things that people
Mhm.
find in the data in the literature. So yeah, I would say definitely read those. And I forgot Eula Taylor. So Eula Taylor's work, Keisha Blaine's work, Natanya Duncan's work, to find out more about that, because Eula Taylor did a whole of the Veiled Garvey, I think a whole book on Amy Jakes Garvey.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I just thought that was interesting because it was just like in passing. They were whatever I was listening to in the book, they were making that pointing out that Amy Jakes was like, I don't know, she's a secretary, she had some kind of administrative role. And then there were questions about overlap
Right.
and whatever, and all of it just stuck in my head. I was like, oh, that's kind of one of the things that happens in movements too, is that like people not being clear and delineated about relationships and how relationships should develop, and then there ends up being problems. So it's just one of my thoughts. um
I did want to address the
mhm.
other issue of um I think maybe what Sister Shinzero was talking about was when I was saying about Atacore Kofi and how because of the notoriety, how she was expelled from the UNIA. At least
Mm-hmm.
that's what the speculation is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do want to say though, both Duncan and Blaine um, really make it clear that women did have a place and a role in the UNIA. So
Mm-hmm.
don't forget, it's 1919, it's the 1920s, right? It's in the early 1930s, and the women in the UNIA had they could vote, they had voting privileges. And so think about it, if women have voting privileges in the UNIA, this is what Natanya Duncan points out in one of her lectures. If women have voting privileges in the UNIA in 1919, that's prior to when women get the vote in the United States and in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely prior to when Black women are enfranchised, because you have to think most African American women in 1920 were living in the South, where African Americans were still
Could not vote. Mm-hmm.
disenfranchised. So, for all intents and purposes, disenfranchised. So women were able. This is a nuanced point that Queen Nzinga Heru made about being a Pan African cultural nationalist in the 1970s, the 1960s and 70s, that her sister made about being a Pan Africanist in the 1960s and 70s. You have to understand that living in a sexist world, these Black nationalist spaces were not perfect,
Mm-hmm.
but were often more nurturing to them in terms of their leadership, in terms of their business skills, in terms of their organizing skills than any place that they found elsewhere. So you have to kind of look at the UNIA as both a nurturing space for women's leadership and a space that was challenging, a space where women also perpetuated patriarchal views about activism and leadership. So it's real, you know, hard to navigate just in a simplistic way, in just a sentence or two.
The way I like to think of it is perfect imperfection.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one.
You know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, it was an oxymoron, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I mean, and that's okay because I think that I mean that's what we're dealing with today. This was an amazing and enlightening conversation. I always like talking to you because you always like get me straight on the history stuff. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. And I really, really appreciate this space, and the chance to talk to you to get more views. I don't know if people had questions, who were watching, but yeah,
Just
like
Chinzira, I know you got to. I know you got to stop. I don't know if you can answer this question. So she said, "Was Du Bois really a valid Pan Africanist?"
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, Du Bois was so. We're not. Remember, we're dealing with humans. We're
Mm-hmm.
dealing with beings, and they're actually the way Dee lays out his book, there's a period that Du Bois dominates the Pan-Africanist movement. So if you look at who organized the Pan-African Congresses from like 1919 through the 1920s, is Du Bois. It's Du Bois who is developing in concert with other people resolutions that are to be presented on the world stage about Black independence, about African independence, about specific independence movements that are brewing. So yes, he is the one who he goes to Ghana, and a part of why he goes to Ghana is to work um in Ghana under Nkrumah's sort of vision within
Mm-hmm.
Nkrumah's vision to make a an academic, as people would say, scientifically developed Pan-Africanism sort of encyclopedia of Pan-African knowledge, like what you need to know about this history, this culture, that's Pan-Africanism. So, yes, he's a very valid Pan-Africanist and a leader in the movement and and a thought leader in terms of developing the ideology.
And I think most people, the conversation becomes like, because he can have some controversial stuff, particularly in his early writings, but just like everybody, he develops over time.
Right.
And so as you look at his writings, that's what you see, is that time, that development over time. Anyway, thank you so much, Dr. McCray. She's an associate professor in history, and this year is a visiting professor at Georgia Institute of Technology. So hopefully we can have another conversation in the future.
Absolutely. It was
All right.
great being here. Thank you so much.
No problem. Take care.
Bye.